In February of 1904, Russia and Japan entered into war. The two powers had been drifting in that direction for over a decade. That war would be emphatically won by Japan, winning every single battle on land and sea. That victory launched Imperial Japan to world power status. However, the peace treaty of Portsmouth to end the war was not everything the Japanese people expected it to be, and their frustration would target the United States. That resentment would lead the two powers to become rivals in the Pacific, ultimately causing them to clash in the Pacific theater during World War II. In that way, World War II has strong roots in the Russo-Japanese War, and more specifically, the Treaty of Portsmouth. That makes the Treaty of Portsmouth vitally important, and not only to the history of Asia, but also world history. So that's why it's time to do a deep dive into all the context you could ever want or need with regards to the Treaty of Portsmouth. In order to understand the context of the peace treaty to end the Russo-Japanese War, you must first understand the context of how the war started and what happened in the war. Let's begin with how the war started. This will not be as in-depth as some of my other videos that are fully dedicated to how a war starts. Instead, this will focus on the main issues that led to Japan and Russia to come into conflict during the early 1900s. The Russo-Japanese War started over Japanese and Russian interests in two regions. Those were Manchuria and Korea. We'll start with how Russia became embroiled in Manchuria and Korea. After all, their major population centers are in Europe. So how did they end up focusing on Asia? To kick things off, Russia in the 1800s had a strategic vulnerability. Ports. Sure, they had a huge landmass, like you can see on the map. And from a distance, they had plenty of access to the oceans of the world, like the Atlantic, Mediterranean, and Pacific. However, when we look closer, we can see how Russian ports were strategically vulnerable. First, let's look at the Baltic region. Russian ports around St. Petersburg did help to ship raw materials to world markets. However, the Baltic can be easily closed shut during a time of war. That is exactly what the Royal Navy did during the Crimean War, blockading Russia's access to the Atlantic by way of the Strait of Skagerrak. Next, let's look at the Black Sea. The Russian city of Sevastopol was their main hub for trade and naval power in that region. However, like the Baltic Sea, this sea could also be easily closed shut. The Bosphorus and the Dardanelles Straits are two narrow passageways that can be used to bottle shut the Black Sea during a time of war. The Royal Navy had also controlled these straits during the Crimean War. As well, this lack of direct access to the Mediterranean is what led Russia, under Nicholas I, to attempt to expand into the Balkans, which would ultimately lead to this already mentioned Crimean War. The third port region to look at for Russia is in Asia, specifically Vladivostok. At first glance, this port looks to have none of the issues of the first two I mentioned, since it directly leads into the Pacific Ocean. However, it has another issue. It's too far north. The cold temperature in this region would lead to the water around the harbor of Vladivostok to freeze and stay frozen for roughly 3 to 4 months every year. This is a big strategic issue, because in trade terms, Vladivostok could never become a true hub of commerce, since a quarter of the year it was inaccessible, while in military terms, it meant that any naval ships stationed there would effectively be blockaded by ice, stuck in port for the winter months. flexibility of deployment is pretty important for warships. Russia's lack of a true warm water, strategically located port was a huge disadvantage in the 1800s. The Industrial Revolution was in full swing, and that had led to nations like Great Britain, the United States, and Germany to grow massively wealthy and give them the ability to create impressive armies and navies. Trade had become critical for a nation to not only grow, but survive. Russia, meanwhile, could have their access cut off to world markets very easily during a time of war. This hurt even more since Russia had not industrialized to the same level as many of the other European powers. Russia's relative share of world manufacturing output in 1880 was 7.6%. Compare that to Great Britain's 22.9%, the United States' 14.7%, France's 7.8%, and Germany's 8.5%. Even with improvements, Russia still lagged behind. By 1900, Russia was only up to 8.8%, while Great Britain was at 18.5%, the United States 23.6%, France 6.8%, and Germany 13.2%. In per capita levels of industrialization, Russia's weakness is even more pronounced. In 1900, relative to the UK, so the UK equals 100, Germany was at 52, the United States 69, France 39, Austria-Hungary 23, and Russia was all the way down at 15. The tiny island nation of Japan, in per capita terms, was at 12. That's how far behind Russia's industrialization and, in consequence, modernization lagged. They were mainly a supplier of raw materials, and not a true manufacturing powerhouse. This kept them at a severe disadvantage. To help with their economic woes, Russia had tried in the past to expand and reach more strategic territory, like in the Balkans. As I mentioned earlier, that would lead to the Crimean War, with Great Britain, France, the Ottomans, and Sardinia on one side against Russia and then Greece. The most famous example of Russia trying to gain more strategic territory was called the Great Game. The Great Game was a rivalry in the 19th century between the British and Russian empires over influence in Central Asia, primarily in Afghanistan, Persia, and Tibet. The two empires used military interventions and diplomatic negotiations to acquire and redefine territories in Central and South Asia. Russia would conquer Turkestan, and Great Britain expanded and set the borders of British India. Ultimately, Great Britain was able to accomplish its goal of keeping Russia away from India, winning the Great Game. With Russian advances into the Mediterranean and Central Asia blocked, the next path towards expansion for the Russian Empire was in Asia. By the 1870s, Russia had formalized its border in the Far East with China. The Ussuri and Amur rivers would be the dividing line. Russian leaders had always dreamed this region would one day be cultivated into an economic powerhouse for the empire. That dream turned out to be a tad overly optimistic. For starters, this region has an incredibly harsh climate. It could not support large agricultural growth due to the soil thawing slowly, which prevented rapid growth of plants. As well, dry winds evaporated the light spring precipitation before it could penetrate the soil, and as a result, young crops suffered from drought. During the summer, it didn't get much better, as high humidity made harvesting grain difficult, while also creating favorable conditions for parasites, rust, mold, fungi, and other diseases that ruined cultivated plants. Even more strategically important, the areas were not conducive to trade. Russian leadership had hoped that by creating the port of Vladivostok, it would become a key center for trade in Asia, specifically China. The Amur River, which was hoped to be used to help facilitate that trade, proved unable to allow free access to ocean-going vessels, and countless sandbars in the river made navigation difficult and dangerous. More than anything though, development of Russia's Far East was difficult because of how isolated it was from the rest of the country. This is where Sergei Witte comes into play. He had vast experience working in the railroad industry for most of his life. And by 1888, he had risen to the rank of Minister of Finance. Under Alexander III, Witte held a tremendous amount of influence. That influence would be used to push Witte's vision for how to enhance the Russian Empire. Witte was a big believer in creating a Trans-Siberian Railroad, which would connect Moscow in the west with Vladivostok in the east. Alexander III gravitated towards this idea. He felt that rail lines and economic expansion would enhance Russian imperialism more than military conquest ever could. The railroad was not without risk, though. It would be a massively costly endeavor. And for a state like Russia in the 1800s, without an advanced economy, paying for it would be difficult. Some context on Russia's economic weakness. Let's look at Europe in 1890. In per capita GNP, or gross national product, or the value of all goods and services made by a country's residents and businesses regardless of production location, Russia was at 182. Meanwhile, Great Britain was at 785. Germany was at 537, France 515, Italy 311, and Austria-Hungary 361. In that context, Russia's economy struggled compared to the rest of Europe's. Witte was able to secure the necessary funds from loans by France. But that would mean that the bill was going to be footed by everyday Russian citizens, as higher taxes would have to be used to pay back the loans. Witte believed that the tax burden could be minimized if the Trans-Siberian Railroad was built with materials and equipment manufactured in Russia. This could also prove to be a bit problematic, as Russia had not industrialized like many of the other powers of the world, like we covered earlier. Witte planned to use the construction of the Trans-Siberian Railroad to give a jolt to the Russian economy, and especially its manufacturing capability. Then, once completed, it would become a key link to Asian trade. The Russians had a lot riding on this Trans-Siberian Railroad. Construction on the rail line would officially begin in 1891. However, Russia had a route problem. The original goal was to have the railroad built only on Russian land, following the Amur and Ussuri rivers to reach Vladivostok. However, the climate and terrain in the Amur River region would make construction extremely hazardous. As well, by following that route, it would be more costly since it was longer. That is why the direct route, cutting across Manchuria, started to be explored by Russian leadership. By going through that route, the railroad would then branch south from Chita, crossing the Chinese border at Manzhouli, then reaching Harbin, and then continuing onwards to Vladivostok. Obviously, this route was more direct, but it also had the added benefit of better terrain to build on. The problem, rather obviously, is that Russia did not control Manchuria. China did. That would mean Russia's pivotal railroad would have to go through another nation's land. At any moment, instability in China, or a change in the minds of their leadership, could lead to the Russian Trans-Siberian Railroad to be cut off in Manchuria. The only way to really ensure the Manchurian route remained open and accessible to Russia would be by occupying Manchuria. Lower costs and economic upside in Manchuria ultimately won out for Nicholas II, who had taken over for his father Alexander III in 1894. All the Russians had to do was convince the Chinese. China in the late 1800s was in a brutal situation. They had been embarrassed in the Sino-Japanese War of 1894 to 95, and the state seemed to be teetering towards a revolution. Russian loans had actually helped China pay its war indemnity for losing to Japan in that conflict. This linked the two nations. Russia presented itself as a protector to China, a protection China desperately needed as it sorted out its own domestic situation. When Russian diplomats met with their Chinese counterparts, they sold the Trans-Siberian Railroad through Manchuria as a way to protect China. Russian troops could use that rail line to come to their aid. In the summer of 1896, the Chinese and Russians came to a secret agreement. If China was attacked again by Japan, Russia would be obligated to join the war on China's side. Originally, China had wanted a promise by Russia that if any power tried attacking China, then Russia would have to come in to assist. But Russian diplomats squashed that quickly and agreed to only come to China's aid in the event of a war with Japan specifically. In exchange for that defensive alliance, the Chinese government would grant permission for the construction of the rail line by a private company called the Chinese Eastern Railway. They would build and operate the line through Manchuria. In this deal, China did not concede its sovereign rights to Manchuria. Interestingly though, that private company was in actuality owned by the Russian government. Russia expanding its control and influence into Manchuria alarmed plenty of powers, but none more so than Japan. Japan had been in the process of modernization and becoming a true power during the mid-1800s. This process started after American Admiral Perry arrived on their shores in 1852. Perry had been sent by President Millard Fillmore to open up Japan to American trade. The Japanese, after more than 200 years of isolation, faced the hard reality of how truly powerless they were when confronted by the big guns of modern warships of the US Navy. This led Japan down a path of revolution, which ultimately led to the Meiji Restoration, which was completed in 1868. With its internal revolutions handled, Japan now needed to start looking external. After all, they didn't just want to be a modern state, but a true power on par with those of Europe. The first and most pressing foreign policy issue facing Japan was the status of Korea. Korea had always held a special importance to the Japanese islands. In a way, it is like a dagger pointed at the heart of Japan. At their closest points, Japan and Korea are only 120 miles from each other. Any invasion of Japan would likely be launched from this peninsula. In order for Japan to expand and become a true power, it must first secure the Korean peninsula. In the 1890s, Korea was essentially under the domain of China. This had been the case since the Qing dynasty took over China in 1644. With the Qing in control of China, Korea went into seclusion. China would have control of Korea's foreign policy. However, domestically, Korea was able to handle its own affairs internally. In 1882, a key moment happened. The Korean peninsula broke out in a revolt that year. That revolt led to both China and Japan to send troops to end the rebellion. The Emo Uprising in 1882 led to some momentous side effects. For China, they would now dominate the Korean peninsula. Whereas before they left Korea to handle its own domestic situation, now China directly interfered, like keeping a troop presence there and setting favorable tariff rates for their own trade at the expense of other nations. More importantly to the story of the Russo-Japanese War, that uprising led to the 1885 Convention of Tianjin. In those meetings between representatives from Japan and China, the Japanese were able to get China to agree to a provision that if Korea ever goes into rebellion again, and that rebellion requires either nation to send troops to the peninsula, they would have to give each other written notice. that they were sending troops to the peninsula. And then, after the situation was stabilized, those troops would have to leave. Why this matters is that China, in essence, had agreed to equal footing on the peninsula with Japan. It did that by stating that China and Japan, not just China anymore, had the legal right to send troops to Korea. In 1894, Korea would once again experience rebellion, named the Tunghak Peasant Rebellion. The situation got so bad, the Korean government reached out to the Qing dynasty in China for help. China then sent in troops, but they did not inform Japan of this. This deeply angered Japan, as it broke the agreements set by the Convention of Tianjin. In response, in June of 1894, Japan started landing troops on the peninsula. Then in July, Japan utilized a force of 8,000 troops to capture the Korean king, Gojong, and occupy Seoul. China did not immediately declare war after this. But then, on July 25th, the Japanese Navy sunk a Chinese troop transport that was taking a task force of 1,100 men to Korea. It was called the Battle of Pungdo. On August 1st, 1894, the First Sino-Japanese War would officially begin. During the First Sino-Japanese War, the Chinese forces would get completely embarrassed by their Japanese counterparts. Japan had been working hard since the Meiji Restoration to create a modern army and navy, while the Chinese army and navy had been falling into decay. The Japanese army would quickly take control of the Korean peninsula, taking Pyongyang in a battle on September 15th. In October, the Japanese army continued their offensive into Manchuria, capturing the strategically important Port Arthur on November 21st. They also took the city of Mukden, the main city in Manchuria. At sea, the Japanese Navy defeated the Chinese Navy at the Battle of the Yalu River on September 17th. That battle forced the Chinese Navy to retreat to Port Arthur, and then from there retreat further to the main Chinese port base of Weihai Wei on the Shandong Peninsula. The Japanese were then able to secure Weihai Wei after a 23-day-long siege from January to February 1895. The Japanese #1 goal in this war was to secure Korea. In order to safely secure Korea from threats, the Japanese needed to control the Liaodong and Shandong peninsulas. The key ports of Arthur and Weihai Wei could be used to threaten Japanese supply lines going to Incheon Harbor near Seoul. Now that Japan had firm control of those two ports, they could begin peace negotiations. In this war, Japan had taken control over all the strategic territory they needed to protect their Korean peninsula. By advancing into Manchuria as far as Mukden, they created a buffer zone to protect Korea from any kind of Russian encroachments. More importantly, though, was the Liaodong Peninsula, and in particular, Port Arthur. Whoever controlled that naval base had the ability to control the entirety of the western coast of Korea. From that port, warships could be sent to interdict any shipping going to Incheon Harbor. Finally, for good measure, the Japanese had secured Weihai Wei on the Shandong Peninsula to make sure it could not be used as a staging position to cut off access to Incheon. Japan was an emphatic victor and looked to enjoy the fruits of its victory. The peace concessions they demanded of China were harsh. The Treaty of Shimonoseki, which ended the war, was signed on April 17, 1895. In it, China recognized the total independence of Korea, which would now be a Japanese protectorate, and they had to cede the Liaodong Peninsula, Taiwan, and the Penghu Islands to Japan in perpetuity. Taiwan, or Formosa as it was called then, was taken over by the Japanese forces in March of 1895, right before the treaty was signed.
Additionally, China was to pay Japan 200 million taels of silver as war reparations. The Qing government also signed a commercial treaty which permitted Japanese ships to operate on the Yangtze River, to operate manufacturing factories in treaty ports, and to open 4 more ports to foreign trade. Japan had officially ended centuries of Chinese dominance in Asia, and was now the dominant Asian power. However, they did not get to enjoy all of their spoils for long. On April 23, 1895, Russia, France, and Germany intervened. Those 3 powers exerted maximum pressure on Japan to give up the Liaodong Peninsula. Japan had no capacity to fight alone against these 3 powers, and gave in, giving away their hard-won gains in Manchuria. Still, they had pushed China out of Korea. However, now they were fighting Russia for influence there. Before we continue, let's give some context as to why the Triple Intervention occurred. We'll start with Germany. Their leaders wanted Russia to focus their attention to the east rather than the west in Europe, where the 2 countries shared a border. Secondly, Germany was also hoping to gain territory in China, and so if they supported Russia here, they could expect the Russians to return the favor later. Next, France. France didn't really have much interest in northern China in Manchuria. Their interests were south in southern China. However, in 1894, France and Russia had become allies. France had been diplomatically isolated before then, and were worried about the strength of Germany. They needed Russia to help balance the growing German state, and so they joined the Triple Intervention to prop up their ally. Finally, Russia. They had the most to actually gain by intervening. Like I mentioned before, in the early 1890s, the Trans-Siberian Railroad started construction, and the Russian leadership had decided to build the line through Manchuria. If Russia intervened and helped China, they would be more likely to accommodate building the rail line through Manchuria, which is exactly what happened. Secondly, the Liaodong Peninsula, up through Mukden, was very important Manchurian real estate for the Russians. If Japan kept territory in Manchuria around Mukden, they could easily threaten the Trans-Siberian Railroad. More importantly, though, was that Port Arthur on the Liaodong Peninsula was exactly what the Russians always wanted and needed. It was a warm water port located in the heart of Asian trade near China. The Russians could connect to it by building a branch line from Harbin through Mukden to reach Port Arthur. This would give Russia a warm water port that would connect Moscow to the East Asian trade with a direct rail link. After Japan released its claim on the Liaodong Peninsula because of the Triple Intervention, Russia next tried to secure that peninsula and add a buffer zone in Korea. The Korean king Gojing was concerned with Japanese intentions, and so after pro-Japanese elements had tried to lead a coup against him, he dismissed his cabinet, which was pro-Japanese, and replaced it with one that was pro-Russian. He then reached out to the Russians for help. Russian diplomats then met with their Japanese counterparts in June of 1896. The Russian foreign minister, Rutovsky, was able to get Japan's civil and military leaders, Ito and Yamagata, to agree to equal rights for Russia and Japan on the Korean peninsula. This was a major blow for Japan. They had just fought a war to secure the critically important peninsula of Korea, and now they shared that right with Russia, who had done no such fighting. Japan's anger would only increase from there. In November of 1897, Germany made good on their desire to acquire Chinese territory. They would take over Qingdao on the southern part of the Shandong Peninsula. In fact, with Nicholas II's blessing. This sent the Russians into a scramble. Muravev, who was now foreign minister for Russia, taking over after Rustovsky died of heart failure, wanted to use this German move as a pretext for the Russians to take over the Liaodong Peninsula and Port Arthur. Witte, the finance minister, who was the mastermind behind the Trans-Siberian Railroad, hated this idea, since it would surely infuriate the Japanese. However, Nicholas ended up siding with Muravev. He was afraid that Great Britain would use Germany's move as a pretext to take over the Liaodong Peninsula. Great Britain did end up taking over Weihai Wei in 1898. Russian warships would sail into the ports of Dairen and Arthur in December of 1897. They then forced the Chinese to sign an agreement on April 25, 1898. That agreement gave Russia a lease of Port Arthur and a concession to build a branch line of the Chinese Eastern Railway to the southern extremity of the Liaodong Peninsula. The Japanese were in stunned disbelief. Russia, in their eyes, had taken all of the key gains they had fought and died for during the Sino-Japanese War. The next key event in the path to war for these two powers would be in 1899. It was called the Boxer Rebellion. The Boxers in China were a nationalist group that rose in popularity on anti-foreign, anti-imperialist, and anti-Christian sentiments in China that grew over the course of the 1800s. Its members were known as the Boxers in English. That was because many of them practiced Chinese martial arts, which at the time were referred to as Chinese boxing. The Qing dynasty did not know how to handle this movement. If they did not suppress it, foreign powers would surely directly interfere into China. However, if they harshly put down this Boxer movement, it could lead the Boxer group to turn from being anti-foreign into anti-Qing dynasty. The events would come to a head in June of 1900, when Boxer fighters, convinced that they were invulnerable to foreign weapons, converged on Beijing. They arrived under the slogan, "Support the Qing government and exterminate the foreigners." An 8-nation coalition was then formed to intervene. Those powers included Great Britain, Germany, France, Russia, Japan, the United States, Italy, and Austria-Hungary. This international coalition force defeated the Imperial Army in Tianjin and arrived in Beijing on August 14th, ending the 55-day siege of the international legations. The Boxer Rebellion had also led to increased hostilities in Manchuria, which threatened Russia's important rail line. And so the Russians sent in their army to secure the region. Invading Manchuria put Russia in a conundrum. The longer their troops stayed occupying Chinese territory, the more the Western powers and Japan would become upset. However, if they left, the instability in Chinese Manchuria would surely lead to the destruction of the Trans-Siberian Railroad there. By this time in 1900, Russia had almost completed the Trans-Siberian Railroad. They had spent a lot of blood and money building it. And so the Russians attempted to get the Chinese to legitimize their annexation of Manchuria. In January of 1901, Russian and Chinese diplomats met. The Russian foreign minister, Muravev, had died, and he was replaced by Lambsdorff. Witte would also be negotiating this deal. On the Chinese side, Yang Ru and Li Hongzhang would be representing the Qing dynasty. At this moment, China felt isolated. The Boxer Rebellion had showcased their weakness once again. And while Russia was strong-arming them, all the other powers seemed disinclined to help. However, the Chinese court managed to stay strong and did not sign away the rights to Manchuria. Their leaders felt that if Russia was allowed to complete this land grab, all the other Western powers would then move in and carve up China. Li Hongzhang would then die on November 7th, 1901. causing negotiations to stall. Russia's continued occupation forced Japan to start making moves of their own to prepare for the inevitable war for control of Manchuria and Korea. Japan needed Korea because of how close it was to their home islands. They also needed Manchurian territory to create a buffer zone to protect Korea, and to utilize the Liaodong Peninsula to protect Korea's western coast. Russia needed Manchuria to help develop their critically important Trans-Siberian Railroad, while they needed Korea as a buffer zone to protect their Manchurian possessions and to help secure trade out of Port Arthur. The most important move Japan made to prepare for war came in 1902. On January 30th, the Anglo-Japanese alliance was signed. The key article of this deal was Article 3. It stated that if either signatory, so either Japan or Great Britain, became involved in a war with more than one power, the other signatory would be obligated to join in. What this means is that if Japan and Russia went to war, Great Britain was under no obligation to join in. However, if France, or even Germany, or both of them, joined Russia's side for that war against Japan, then Great Britain was duty-bound to join the war on Japan's side. This was a huge deal, because it effectively isolated Russia in the event of a war with Japan, and prevented any kind of triple intervention type scenario. France and Germany would not risk a war with Great Britain over China, and so now Japan just needed to handle Russia one-on-one. Why did Great Britain sign this deal? Well, starting in 1899, the British Empire started hitting difficulties. Before then, the island nation had enjoyed splendid isolation, avoiding any entanglements in major wars for about 50 years. Then the Second Boer War broke out in 1899, and it lingered on until 1902. That war showcased the British leadership their precarious position. They had so many possessions across the globe that they were becoming stretched thin with pain points. Even a far-off place like South Africa could cause extreme difficulty. Furthermore, the other European powers, like Germany, France, and Russia, weren't exactly upset to see Great Britain have to deal with the costly Boer War. That drove home the point that Great Britain had no real allies they could count on. What made matters worse, in the 1890s and early 1900s, Germany began building up its naval strength, and that could be a direct threat to the home island. To top it off, the Russian occupation of Manchuria alarmed British Foreign Minister Lansdowne, as he became concerned as to what their next move in China would be. By forming an alliance with Japan, the British could keep Asia stable and prevent Russian domination of China, without having to actively do anything. Instead, the British could ship their naval resources and focus closer to home to meet the growing German threat. Great Britain would not be the only nation to support Japan in their war with Russia. The United States would also back them. The Russian move into Manchuria is exactly the opposite of what American foreign policy wanted in 1900. The United States believed in the open door policy with regards to China and Asia. They did not want the nations of Europe to carve up China and guard their possessions. Instead, they wanted equal opportunity for all nations' trade. This open door policy had been guided by U.S. Secretary of State John Hay. And when Teddy Roosevelt took over the presidency, after the assassination of McKinley in Buffalo by anarchists in September of 1901, Teddy would fully embrace pushing the open door policy. With British and American support backing the Japanese, they had the full confidence to embark on a war with Russia. Ito, who was an influential Japanese political figure in this era, had actually met with Russian Foreign Minister Lambsdorff in 1901 to discuss alleviating the two nations' tensions. The deal Ito was looking for was that Japan would have full control of Korea in exchange for acquiescing to Russian control of Manchuria. Those talks were ultimately abandoned by the Japanese, after the British expressed their interest into entering into an alliance. The Russians had missed a perfect opportunity to secure Manchuria diplomatically. Ultimately, the crisis that would push Russia and Japan to war, weirdly enough, had to do with timber rights in northern Korea. In 1896, the Korean king, Gojong, agreed to sign away a large concessionary area in northern Korea, roughly the size of Delaware. The timber tract was close to the Yalu and Tumen rivers. The timber deal initially did not cause a controversy, mainly because the Russians did not develop it. Then, in 1900, the concession was close to expiring if the Russians did not exploit it. A Russian by the name of Bezobravov, a businessman born to a noble family, looked to execute Russia's timber rights in Korea. He convinced Nicholas II to personally invest into this venture. And by invest, I mean Nicholas would actually buy 200 shares in Bezobravov's East Asiatic Company. Nicholas made this decision despite Vita's and Muravyev's strong objections. They were sure this move directly into Korea would infuriate the Japanese. They wanted the Manchurian issue to be fixed before going on any kind of bold business ventures. However, at this point, Vita's influence in the Russian court was waning. The Boxer Rebellion had been blamed on his Trans-Siberian Railroad going through Manchuria. In April of 1903, the next key event occurred. The second deadline for the Russians to withdraw their troops from Manchuria came and went. Nicholas then announced to his ministers that Russia was embarking on a new course. Manchuria was to be considered within Russia's sphere of exclusive political and economic interest, which effectively rejected the open door policy. Russia would also use the timber concession on the Yalu River as a pretext to strengthen its position in Korea. Then on August 16, 1903, Nicholas dismissed Vita. This mattered because Vita was the main voice in the Russian government who wanted to work on a conciliatory policy towards Japan. With him gone, the path to avoid war became virtually non-existent. Russia's refusal to remove troops from Manchuria and their control of the Yalu River made Teddy Roosevelt side with Japan. He felt Japan could be a good partner to promote the open door policy, perfect to counterbalance Russia's land grabbing. On August 12, 1903, Japanese envoy Kurino submitted a proposal to Russia in the hopes of coming to an agreement. The Japanese proposed a deal which would acknowledge Russia's railway interests in Manchuria in exchange for Japanese unrestricted activity in Korea, which included access to the Yalu ports that Russia had taken over in their timber deal. It was essentially the same deal as the one proposed back in 1901. Lambsdorff was open to this deal, but Nicholas had recently created a new position called Viceroy of the Far East. The new position was given to Admiral Alexeyev, and he had far-ranging power. The Viceroy of the Far East had the power to exclusively deal with all matters related to China, Korea, and Japan. Essentially, it was a second government in the East. Alexeyev rejected the Japanese proposal. He did not want to cede full control of Korea to Japan. The Russians then sent their counter-proposal to the Japanese Foreign Minister, Kimura. In the Russian proposal, they would acknowledge Japanese position in southern Korea only, but the area north of the 39th parallel was to be recognized by both parties as a neutral zone. The Russians further insisted on Japan having no military presence in Korea. This deal would essentially concede the northern half of Korea to Russia.
Since the Korean king Gojing was pro-Russian, he would likely sign a secret deal with Russia to give them virtual control of the north.
Japan responded to this proposal coolly, only offering a neutral zone further north, on either side of the Korean-Manchurian border. Great Britain and the United States then jumped in. They firmly demanded that Russia needed to open the Yalu ports. The pressure was mounting. The active US and British support stiffened the Japanese resolve. Their final proposal in January of 1904 showcased that new confidence. The Japanese outright rejected Russia's proposed restrictions on their country's strategic use of Korean territory, and to the creation of a neutral zone. They further demanded that Russia recognize the territorial integrity of Korea and China. Finally, Japan demanded that their rights and privileges in Manchuria be respected. Russia's leadership, led by Nicholas II, failed to properly comprehend Japan's growing confidence and resolve. They were not going to take an unequal treaty, and if necessary, they would go to war over Korea. Nicholas firmly believed that war was not going to happen. The reason was simple. He did not want to go to war. And in his mind, the tiny Japanese island nation would never be foolish enough to take on the great Russian Empire. He said as much. In January of 1904, he stated to a diplomatic corps, including the Japanese envoy to Russia, Japan must remember that Russia is not only a country, but an empire. And he further went on to state, in my opinion, the danger of war has been averted, since I told the Japanese minister that I did not want it. That's how overconfident Nicholas was before the war. The Tsar's arrogant declarations would be answered by the Japanese on February 6, 1904, when they approved breaking off diplomatic relations. Breaking off diplomatic relations is usually the final move before officially declaring war. And yet, the Russians still seemed unfazed by Japan's response. Alexeyev didn't even put any of the Russian Far East forces on heightened alert. The Japanese had broken off negotiations and were preparing to fight it out, while the Russians remained blissfully overconfident. On the evening of February 8, 1904, that Russian bliss would be shattered by the Japanese surprise attack on the naval squadron at Port Arthur. In concert with the attack on the Russian Pacific Fleet by Japanese torpedo boats, the Japanese army would land an invasion force at Incheon Harbor. Their goal was to move up the Korean peninsula and secure it, exactly like they had done in the Sino-Japanese War. These two strikes by the Japanese were the opening moves of their carefully prepared war plan to defeat the Russian Empire. Next, I will cover that plan, and how the Japanese won an emphatic victory in the Russo-Japanese War. From the earliest days when the Japanese first began contemplating a war with Russia, it was recognized that the war would be won or lost in the maritime theater. From that basic tenet branched off Japan's overall strategy for the war. The Japanese overall goals for this war would be to first secure the landmass of the Korean peninsula, then secure the Liaodong Peninsula, and in particular Port Arthur, in order to secure Korea's western coast for logistic supply lines, and then finally move into Manchuria to create a buffer zone for Korea. The surprise attack on Port Arthur would be the first strike. The goal would be to cripple the Russian Pacific Squadron. The existence of the Russian Pacific Squadron at Port Arthur would prevent any Japanese landing at Incheon Harbor. and so its existence would force the Japanese to land their army in southern Korea before having to march north to Seoul. In that scenario, it would be a very time-consuming advance for the Japanese army. And logistically, it would be a nightmare to support that advance, with supplies that would have to be carried from southern Korea to the north. The Port Arthur warships were the key determining factor in the success or failure of the Japanese campaign in Korea. That's how strategically located Port Arthur was in the Yellow Sea. The Japanese surprise attack on the Russian Pacific Squadron caused severe but not crippling damage. Admiral Togo, commander-in-chief of the Japanese Combined Fleet, then moved his fleet of warships into position in order to keep the Russian ships stuck at Port Arthur, unable to link up with the Russian squadron at Vladivostok. The Russian warships being bottled up at Port Arthur gave the Japanese the freedom of action to start their land campaign. The Japanese First Army would land at Incheon Harbor, west of Seoul. They had a very important job ahead. The First Army was to advance north and breach the Yalu River line into Manchuria. Until the Yalu was breached, the Japanese 2nd, 3rd, and 4th Armies could not disembark to land on the Liaodang Peninsula. How did the Russians plan to counter the Japanese Port Arthur attack and the land invasion of Korea? Well, they didn't really have a strong plan. Because, like I said earlier, in the pre-war period, they had put very little credence or faith into a war with Japan. Now that war was a reality, the Russian Minister of War, Kuropatkin, took command of the army in the field. He arrived at Liaoyang in mid-March of 1904. His plan was simple but logical. He would win a war of attrition. The Russian army in the Far East numbered roughly 100,000 men, but they were spread out over vast distances. As well, it would take time for the Russians to add to that strength by shipping reinforcements across the Trans-Siberian Railroad. That is why Kuropatkin would look to trade space for time. His army would not be able to resist the Japanese advance in Korea. However, he would use Cossacks to harass that advance, while fortifying a strong defensive line on the Yalu, forcing the Japanese to commit heavy resources in order to break that line. By the time the Japanese gained a foothold in Manchuria, the Russian reinforcements could then be used to roll back Japanese gains all the way into Korea. Over time, this Russian strategy could have worked, since Russia had an army numbering over 1 million men, while the Japanese only had an army of roughly 300,000 men. Even worse for Japan, any long war would put a drain on their ability to replace losses. The Japanese population at this time was 44 million. Compare that to Russia's 135 million. Unfortunately for the Russians, they executed this strategy dreadfully. For starters, the Russian Pacific Squadron never was able to break out of Port Arthur. If they could have linked up with the Vladivostok fleet, it could have created a dangerous striking force that could threaten Japanese supply lines. The strongest attempt the Russians made resulted in the Battle of the Yellow Sea in August of 1904. The Russians would have 6 battleships, 4 cruisers, and 14 torpedo boats facing off against Admiral Togo and his fleet of 4 battleships, 10 cruisers, and 18 torpedo boats. In the resulting battle, the Russian flagship suffered severe damage, with the commander of the Russian Pacific Squadron, Wittgeft, dying. Without a commander, the Russian warships drifted into confusion, ultimately retreating back to safety under the guns of Port Arthur. From there, the Russian Pacific Squadron would stay put until the fall of Port Arthur. On land, the Russian Cossacks did not impede the Japanese First Army at all. And once the Japanese reached the Yalu River, they made an even bigger mistake. Kuropatkin had divided his army into two detachments, one southern and one eastern. The southern force was to guard against an attack on the Liaodong Peninsula, while the eastern one was meant to frustrate any crossing by the Japanese First Army on the Yalu. The Battle of the Yalu River would occur on May 1st, 1904, and be the first time that Japanese and Russian forces went toe-to-toe on the battlefield in a major action. This battle would set the theme for the whole war. Japanese forces moved aggressively and with strong purpose, taking key ground on the Russian left flank. Once outpositioned, the Russians were forced to withdraw back to Liaoyang. This was a massive psychological moment in the war. Before the war, Russian leaders felt that the Japanese would have no chance of beating their army in a traditional battle. But during the first major engagement of the war, the Russians were decisively outclassed. Less than 48 hours after the First Army reported its victory on the Yalu, the next phase of the Japanese offensive would begin. The Japanese Second Army landed at Pitzu on May 4th and 5th. First and Second Armies would then both advance north to combine at Liaoyang, where the Russian Manchurian Army was located. Breaching the Yalu would also trigger the Japanese Fourth and Third Armies to embark on their landings on the Liaodong Peninsula. The Fourth Army would land at Takushan, and then continue on to Liaoyang as well, while the Third Army was to land at Darun with the goal of securing Port Arthur before moving north to link up with 1st, 2nd, and 4th Armies. However, the Third Army needed the help of 2nd Army before it could take Port Arthur. The key to taking Port Arthur would be breaking through the Russian defensive line in the hills at Nanshan. The Japanese Second Army would take on this task. After landing at Pitsau, they would march south to break through the Russian defense. Once the Nanshan line was cleared, the Russians would be forced to reposition around Port Arthur, which is when the Japanese Third Army could then land at Darun and begin the assault on Port Arthur. The Russian defenses at Nanshan were formidable. They had dug trenches and set up minefields with barbed wire covered by machine guns. It was the first time barbed wire had been used to turn a large area into a killing zone for machine gun fire, a technique that would be used with devastating effects during World War I. The Battle of Nanshan began on May 24th. The Japanese would hurl men forward in 9 separate assaults at the strong Russian defenses, only to get brutally cut down. Finally, on the 10th attack, Japanese forces were able to turn the Russian flank by wading through the water of Jinzhou Bay. Russian General Foch then panicked and called for a full-scale retreat, rather than just a limited retreat to form a second line of defense. In the battle, the Japanese had lost over 6,000 killed, wounded, or captured, while the Russians had lost over 1,600 killed, wounded, or captured. But the path to Port Arthur was now open. The fragile position Port Arthur found itself in after Nanshan is what led Viceroy Alexeyev to order the warships in port to try and break out and link up with the Vladivostok squadron. As I mentioned, the Port Arthur fleet was defeated at the Battle of the Yellow Sea. That was not their only naval defeat, though. The Vladivostok fleet had tried to go south to link up with the Port Arthur squadron, and they were also defeated. Japan now had firm control of the seas. The loss of Port Arthur and its fleet would be an immense loss of prestige for the Russians. And since the Port Arthur fleet had failed to break out, the only option would be some kind of relief force to break through to save the city's garrison. The Tsar would send a naval relief force, which was created out of the Baltic Fleet. It was renamed the 2nd Pacific Squadron, but that force would not begin to set sail until October of 1904. Until then, both Nicholas and Alexeyev pushed Kuropatkin to take the offensive and relieve the isolated garrison. Kuropatkin hated this because he felt his army was unprepared to take the offensive at this moment. He needed more reinforcements. By August 10th, the Japanese Third Army was closing in around Port Arthur. Nogi, the commander of Third Army, would next begin his assaults on the Port Arthur defenses. Those assaults would begin on August 19th and go extremely poorly. The Japanese were feeling anxious to conquer Port Arthur as quickly as possible. Commander-in-Chief of the Japanese armies, Oyama, felt pressure that with each passing day, the Russian army in Manchuria would gain more and more strength, while the news of the Russian Baltic fleet preparing to set sail drove home the fact that the Japanese needed to secure Port Arthur so that they could exert their maximum effort in Manchuria, to secure that region before the massive amounts of Russian reinforcements made that impossible. Oyama needed decisive victories. The sooner the port was captured, the sooner Nogi's Third Army could join the First, Second, and Third Armies to destroy the Russian Manchurian army. Oyama was in search of a Sedan-like decisive victory to end the land war. During the Battle of Sedan, during the Franco-Prussian War, Moltke's armies decisively destroyed the French army, and even captured the leader of France, Napoleon III. Oyama dreamed of soundly crushing Kuropatkin's Manchurian army in battle, which would force the Russian government to sue for peace. To achieve this decisive victory, First, Second, and Fourth Armies would engage Kuropatkin's force at Liaoyang before Third Army took Port Arthur. They would engage the Russians in the Battle of Liaoyang on August 25th. Kuropatkin had 158,000 men and 609 guns at his disposal, while the Japanese had 115,000 men and 170 guns spread across Oyama's three armies. The combined total of forces confronting each other was nearly 300,000, one of the largest combined forces to meet in battle in history at the time. Only at Sedan in the Franco-Prussian War were more men involved. For the battle, Kuropatkin had set up a strong defense. He had 3 layers of defensive lines. An outer line some 15 to 20 miles south of the city, the main line, which was about 5 miles south, anchored by Karen Hill on its western end, and finally the city itself, which was fortified. The Russians had prepared strong defensive fortifications, much like they had done at Nanshan, with trenches, machine guns, and barbed wire. Actually, some of the barbed wire was electrified. The Japanese forces were spread out, with Second Army led by Oku on the Japanese left, Fourth Army led by Nozu in the middle, and Kuroki's First on the right. Oyama had a simple plan. Oku's Second Army would start the action by launching a frontal attack. Nozu's Fourth would then advance to draw in the Russian reserves. This would set the stage for Kuroku's First to swing around the Russian eastern flank, and then head towards the rail line north of Liaoyang. This move would cut off their retreat route and surround Kuropatkin's army. When the battle began, the Second Army encountered tough resistance on the Russian right. But on the far left, the Russians had failed to properly place any forces or cavalry to stop First Army's advance. By August 30th, the First Army was in position to outflank the Russians. This threat to his rear was the thing that Kuropatkin had most feared before the battle, and so he ordered his forces to withdraw from the main defensive line to reposition his forces to meet the threat to his rear. This move gave the Japanese the perfect opportunity to seize key strategic ground. They quickly set up artillery on Karen Hill, which gave them the ability to hit Liaoyang itself. By September 3rd, with his retreat route in jeopardy and Japanese artillery blasting away at the city, Kuropatkin ordered a general retreat north to Mukden. The Japanese forces were too exhausted to pursue, and so Kuropatkin's army lived to fight another day. Oyama's decisive victory had eluded him. However, any chance of that Russian force being able to relieve Port Arthur was now gone. In casualty terms in the battle, the Japanese lost over 5,000 killed, while the Russians had lost over 3,000 killed. Okay, let's shift back to Port Arthur and the siege there. The failure of the Russian army at Liaoyang left the garrison at Port Arthur with very little hope. The best they could do was to hold out as long as possible to prevent the Japanese Third Army from joining the other three armies. The Japanese, meanwhile, looked to break the garrison as quickly as possible. When Nogi's Third Army reached the outer limits of the Port Arthur defenses, he looked to take the city the same way it had been taken during the Sino-Japanese War, by capturing the two strong points called Big and Little Orphan Hills. After taking those hills, they would move on to take the old forts along the Chinese wall. After breaking through there, the road to the port city would be wide open. However, since taking over the city from the Chinese, the Russians had significantly strengthened the defenses on Little and Big Orphan Hills. Once again, the Russians had a formidable defense of machine guns, barbed wire, and landmines. Nogi would then try several frontal assaults to take those hills. Those assaults were decimated and ultimately failed. On October 22nd, Nogi had launched his second general assault. He had actually been advised by General Geishi that Third Army should focus on taking 203 Meter Hill, located to the northwest. From that high point, the Japanese would be able to direct artillery fire on the city, and more importantly, the Russian fleet in harbor. Nogi rejected this, because he felt it was a diversion from where the main focus should be, and the 203 Meter Hill approach would take too long to achieve results. Nogi preferred frontal assaults with the goal of breaking the Russian defensive line in the east. On November 26th, Nogi launched his third general assault, which was once again brutally cut down for no real gains. The third assault's failure forced Oyama and his chief of the general staff, Kodama, to intervene. Oyama put Kodama temporarily in charge of the Third Army, so that he could directly seize control of 203 Meter Hill. This was a delicate matter, because Nogi was a hero in the Sino-Japanese War. He was actually the general who had taken Port Arthur in that conflict. Nogi was exhausted from his continued failures, and so he acquiesced to Kodama taking brief control. The Japanese Third Army now shifted its focus to taking 203 Meter Hill, which they were able to do on December 5th, after intense shelling and repeated assaults. The Third Army could now blast the town and the harbor with heavy artillery. Within 2 days, 3 battleships and 2 cruisers were sunk. And finally, on January 2nd, 1905, General Stossel formally surrendered Port Arthur. Total losses for the Japanese was 91,000 casualties, while the Russians had lost 55,000 casualties. In Russia, the surrender of Port Arthur was highly controversial, as Nicholas had ordered their commander to hold out until the last man. However, Stossel had become disillusioned with that approach after the Japanese had taken 203 Meter Hill, and relief from the sea or land was not coming anytime soon. The more significant side effect of the fall of Port Arthur, as well as the just general poor performance in the war, as the Russians had lost every single battle to the Japanese, was the Russian Revolution of 1905 broke out. The main trigger for this revolt had to do with the war showcasing the Russian ruling class's incompetence. The climax would occur on January 22nd, 1905, nicknamed Bloody Sunday. On that date, unarmed protesters were fired upon by the Tsar's troops. This revolution would then linger on into 1906, only ending after Tsar Nicholas agreed to reforms like a constitution and an elected legislature, called the Duma. The 1905 revolution set the stage for the much more famous 1917 Russian Revolution. Vladimir Lenin later famously described the revolution of 1905 as the dress rehearsal, without which the victory of the October Revolution in 1917 would have never been possible. The Russo-Japanese War was not the sole cause of the Russian Revolution, but it certainly helped to speed up the fall of Tsarist Russia. Now that Port Arthur had surrendered, the next key objective for the Japanese army would be to defeat Kuropatkin's army at Mukden. Before Nogi's Third Army could reach Oyama's other three armies near Mukden, the Russians would finally try an offensive attack of their own. The battle would be called Sandepu and take place on January 25th, 1905. The goal was to push the Japanese army back to Liaoyang. Kuropatkin had his forces spread out in three armies. First Army, commanded by Linovich, held the Russian left. Third Army, commanded by Kolbars, held the center. And Second Army, commanded by Grippenberg, held the right. Kuropatkin had 300,000 men under his command, while Oyama's forces were roughly 200,000 men strong, but could reach close to 300,000 once the Third Army arrived. The Russian attack was supposed to hit the Japanese left hard, turning their flank. Once their flank was turned, First and Third Armies would advance. However, that is not what happened. The Second Army's attack did have some initial success, but it took time as it met strong resistance. By the time the Russians had a chance to break through, Kuropatkin had grown nervous and called an end to the attack. The ultimate failure of this attack was that it wasn't coordinated. Two Russian armies sat stationary all battle and did not advance to put pressure all across the front. As a result, the Japanese were able to save their left flank just barely. Kuropatkin did plan for another attack, but Oyama would beat him to the punch. The Battle of Mukden would feature over 500,000 men, nearly 300,000 Russians and well over 200,000 Japanese, the largest land force ever assembled in the history of warfare. Oyama wanted to end the war right here and now by destroying Kuropatkin's force in an emphatic battle to win the war. The Japanese army was exhausted at this point. They needed a decisive victory. They could not compete in the long term with Russia's ability to replace losses. By mid-February, Oyama had Third Army at his disposal. As well, he had the newly created Fifth Army. Fifth Army was commanded by Kageki, and he marched his force into position on the Japanese extreme right. Next to Third Army was First Army, then Fourth Army, then Second Army, and finally Third Army. Oyama's plan called for a feint on the right by First and Fifth Armies. Then, with the Russian left engaged, Oyama would send Third Army on a wide flanking move around the Russian right flank, with the goal of reaching their rear and threatening the rail line north out of Mukden. If the Russians were deceived into thinking the main attack was in the east, Fourth and Second Armies would advance to break through to the east of Mukden in order to link up with Third Army to the north of the city, trapping the Russian armies in an encirclement. The plan was a textbook double envelopment. It was a bold plan, but it was aided significantly by the fact that the Russians had terrible intelligence gathering, which was a theme throughout this war. Kuropatkin had very little knowledge of Japanese troop strength and disposition. He only had a vague idea of the newly formed Fifth Army. Furthermore, he had no clue where the Japanese Third Army was. Kuropatkin had planned for his offensive to begin on February 24th, and it was essentially a repeat of the last battle plan. But Oyama seized the initiative by launching his Fifth Army against the Russian First Army on February 23rd. After the Japanese Fifth make contact with the Russian first, Kuropatkin responded by sending his entire reserve division to meet what he believed to be the main Japanese attack. Next, the Japanese First Army joined in on the attack. The two attacks on the Russian left made solid progress. Then, on February 28th, the Japanese used their big guns to begin bombarding the Russian Third Army in the center. Now, Kuropatkin thought the main attack was coming at his center. This is when the greatest shock of all occurred. Cossacks on the Russian extreme right flank noticed a large force moving north. This was Nogi's Third Army. A great panic then ensued, as Kuropatkin had no more reserves to counter this threat. The fighting would intensify, as the Japanese slowly closed in around the Russian army. Finally, on March 9th, as Kuropatkin's army was teetering on the brink of being surrounded, he ordered a full-scale retreat to Harbin. The Japanese armies were once again too exhausted to pursue. Oyama's decisive victory had slipped through his fingers. The Russian army in Manchuria had been defeated and demoralized, but not destroyed. Kuropatkin had lost here because he had failed to consider the strategic goals. He had been raised in a Russian military culture where their greatest victory was against Napoleon during his invasion of Russia in 1815. Napoleon's campaign failed because he won a string of tactical victories but failed to win any strategic ones. Kuropatkin had designed his war plan against Japan in the same logic, trading space for time in order to win a war of attrition. However, by this point in the war, the Russians needed a victory. They were on the brink of full-scale revolution back home. And yet still at Mukden, Kuropatkin avoided taking the offensive and let Oyama seize the initiative. The final battle of the Russo-Japanese War would take place at sea in May of 1905. The Russian 2nd Pacific Squadron, or Baltic Fleet, had continued on their long journey of over 7 months and 18,000 nautical miles even after Port Arthur had fallen. Their new goal was to link up with what was left of the Vladivostok fleet, instead meeting Togo's Japanese combined fleet in the Tsushima Strait. This iconic battle pitted 8 Russian battleships against Japan's 4, but Japan had British-built battleships. They were of much higher quality, with higher explosive ability, had better range-finding technology, and increased wireless communication ability. Combine that with Japanese crews being better trained and having more experience fighting, while fighting very close to home against an enemy exhausted from a long journey around the world. And that's how you get a decisive advantage for the Japanese. The battle would end up being a massacre. Admiral Togo boldly crossed the Russians' T and devastated them with cannon fire. The total Russian losses were 6 battleships sunk and 2 more captured. Out of their other 30 ships, 15 others were sunk and 9 more put out of action. The Russians lost 5,000 total killed, while the Japanese, as a whole, lost a total of 3 torpedo ships sunk and 117 dead. The Japanese had won their decisive victory at sea, one of the most decisive in the history of naval warfare. This was the last real action of the war. Russia had been thoroughly defeated on land and sea, while Japan was at the end of its tether. Their army was down to its last reserves, and the navy was running low on ammunition and coal. This is when Teddy Roosevelt steps onto the scene, and the Treaty of Portsmouth gets negotiated. Let's go in depth into what each power looked to achieve and how the negotiations ultimately played out. After the battles of Mukden and Tsushima, Teddy Roosevelt's White House sent out official peace initiative notes to both Japan and Russia on June 9th. Nicholas had initially been reluctant to make peace. He did not want to end the war with Russia having been defeated in every single battle. That would be a huge blow to their world prestige. Ultimately, he was convinced of the wisdom of peace negotiations because at this point, no Russian territory had yet been taken in the war. Korea and Manchuria had never officially been theirs. That could change quickly if the Japanese moved to take the island of Sakhalin. As well, with revolutionary turmoil spreading throughout Russia, especially in areas like Finland, in the future Baltic states, and in the Black Sea region, Russian leadership wanted to focus on their domestic situation rather than fighting a faraway, unpopular foreign war. And so Nicholas agreed. The Japanese were divided at first on whether it was the right time for peace. Some wanted to continue on and take Russian territory, possibly even threatening Siberia. But at the very least, they felt they should at least take the Russian territory of Vladivostok. One of the most important voices in Japan for peace was Kodama. Before the war, he was the Minister of the Army, and a strong advocate for war with Russia. He had been vital in planning Japanese strategy for when war did break out with Russia. And once war officially was declared, Kodama worked under Oyama as his chief of the general staff. The conflict had exhausted Japan's war-making capacity, and no one knew that better than Kodama. The Russians had regrouped on land after Mukden, and improved their rail logistics across the Trans-Siberian rail line. They had 500,000 men, and growing, between Harbin and Vladivostok. It was likely that if the Japanese attempted in advance to take Vladivostok, they would be facing a Russian army 3 times its size, while stretching out their own logistics supply lines through rugged, grainless country north of Mukden. Even more alarming, the Japanese could only increase their field army in Manchuria with an additional 1 to 1.5 divisions. Their military manpower had been exhausted. In fact, the Japanese had suffered such strong casualties that most of their officers in the field at this point were elderly reserve officers, since all the younger ones had been killed. Kodama and Oyama were able to effectively convince Japanese leadership, led by Prime Minister Katsura, that now was the time to negotiate peace, while Japan was still in a strong position, and before a Russian counteroffensive in Manchuria could begin, which could significantly hurt their leverage and territorial holdings. And so Japan also agreed to Teddy's peace initiative. However, a month after agreeing, they made good on Nicholas's fears and took the island of Sakhalin. Japan now held Russian territory, strengthening their leverage for when the two sides met. The two countries' delegates would be meeting in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, starting on August 8, 1905. Washington, D.C. had been ruled out because during the summer months, the climate was hot, humid, and basically unbearable. It was, after all, a swamp. Air conditioning is a wonderful thing. Before I go into that conference, I must first give some context for all the parties involved, so Japan, Russia, and the United States. Mainly, I am going to go into what each side was hoping to accomplish, and in the case of Japan and Russia, what were their strengths and weaknesses going into peace talks. Let's start with Russia. Going into peace talks, they had lost every single battle of the war, being thoroughly defeated on land and sea. So how could they possibly have any strengths? Well, for starters, as much as Japan had won on the battlefield, Russia hadn't truly lost anything that was theirs. At this point, Japan had control of Korea, the Liudong Peninsula, and Manchuria up to Mukden. However, that was all Chinese territory. Sure, Russia had lease rights to Liudong, but that didn't really make it Russian. In fact, the only piece of quote-unquote Russian land they had was Sakhalin. I put that in quotes because the southern portion of Sakhalin had been Japanese until 1875, when Japan traded that area for the Kuril Islands, so it wasn't really traditionally Russian. Furthermore, Russia would not bend over backwards to have it returned. it wasn't of critical importance to the empire. Even if the Japanese had managed to take Vladivostok, which would have been unlikely in any scenario, that was not a prestigious city in Russian history. It's not like Japan conquered Moscow. Another strength had to do with Russian war-making potential. Like I said earlier, the Japanese population was 44 million, compared to Russia's 135 million. As well, in proportional terms, the Japanese had suffered significantly worse. During the war, Japan deployed a total of 1.2 million men, while Russia deployed 1.3 million men. In total casualty losses, Japan had lost roughly 100,000 killed and 173,000 wounded, while in casualty terms for Russia, they had lost roughly 70,000 killed, 146,000 wounded, and 75,000 captured. That loss ratio meant Japan had lost roughly 23% of the total army they had deployed during the war. Compare that to Russia, who had lost just 16% of the total army they deployed. Factor that in with Russia's significantly better capacity to replace losses, and you have a decisive edge there. Russia had the ability to build up their army in the Far East to over 1 million men, with many more that could be sent to supplement that force and replace losses. Meanwhile, Japan could only field an army of roughly 500,000, and maybe at best 1 million. But that would mean sending men outside the normal range of 17 to 30 years old, which was what usually constituted military-aged men. Plain and simple, if this turned into a drawn-out war of attrition, Russia could slowly roll back Japanese gains, while Japan had maximized their potential. This is a huge leverage to have. However, Russia was obviously not all strengths. For starters, this war was deeply unpopular among the citizens of the state. If it turned into a drawn-out war of attrition, that would mean more money and men dying in this faraway conflict. Russia was already in revolution in January of 1905, and was still sorting that out. If they continued fighting in the Far East, it could lead to a total collapse of the monarchy. That is what happened in 1917, after 3 years of inconclusive war with high casualties and high expenses. Furthermore, Russia may not even have the money to continue to pay for the war. The French were the Russians' main ally in this era, and they were their main source of loans. However, this destructive war had made the French leadership question Russia's path. French Premier Royle had told Witte that if peace negotiations were broken off, that Russia would receive no more loans to continue the war. However, if Russia was forced to pay an indemnity as part of the peace treaty, France would give loans to help them pay that. France, like many of the other powers, just wanted this war to end. Let's move on to goals then. With this war being far removed from Russia proper, and deeply unpopular, what were the Russian goals at the peace conference? Nicholas II had one primary goal supported by two secondary goals. The first overall strategic goal was to preserve Russian prestige. They would not be dictated to and would not accept peace at any price. To accomplish that overall strategic goal, it would mean that Russia would absolutely not accept a peace treaty which gave over Russian land or had Russia pay a war indemnity. Those were their two red line items. The man who would be sent to deal with the difficult task of negotiating a peace treaty is a familiar one: Witte. Witte was selected for what many deemed a thankless task. But he was the best man the Russians had at their disposal for these type of high-pressure negotiations. And even though Nicholas II had dismissed Witte and held no fond feelings for his former finance minister, no one else wanted this job. And so Witte it had to be. Okay, let's shift over to the Japanese. They had emphatically showcased their military power in this war. So shouldn't they have been able to dictate whatever terms they wanted? And what did they actually want? What was mission critical, and what were just supplementary goals? Let's answer all of those questions. First, we need to contextualize their strengths and weaknesses at the negotiating table. Their strengths are rather straightforward. They had trounced the Russians on land and sea. In fact, they had defeated the Russian Navy so thoroughly that they had complete control of the seas, while Russia had no real first-class ships left. Furthermore, this area was of critical importance to their nation. Manchuria, and more importantly Korea, were seen as vital foreign policy issues for the state. The Russian Empire, on the other hand, was mainly centered in Europe, and so these issues were far removed from their critically important regions. As well, Russia was on the brink of full-scale revolution that could topple the government, while Japan was unified behind the war effort. So it made sense Russia would need peace more than Japan, right? Well, not totally. The Japanese had their fair share of weaknesses going into negotiations. We will start with money. So far, the war had cost Japan 1.7 billion yen. For context, the annual national income for Japan in this era was only 2 billion yen. Japan had paid for this war primarily by borrowing from countries like the US and Great Britain. Those loans had pushed Japan into over $50 million of foreign war debt. Spending at this level for much longer could destroy the island nation's economy, as no less than 53% of their budget went to war expenses. Even more importantly though, the burden of this war debt had affected the citizens of Japan deeply, since the country had to raise taxes in order to pay for the war. The hope was that a Japanese victory would mean Russia paying a war indemnity to cover the costs of the war for Japan, alleviating the pressure on everyday Japanese citizens. To add further complications, both the United States and Great Britain had put pressure on the Japanese to come to peace terms, or else there would be no more loans granted. Great Britain and the United States did not want this war lingering on, and possibly lead to the collapse of Tsarist Russia. Great Britain needed Russia to counterbalance Germany in Europe, and the US needed Russia to counterbalance Japan in the Far East. Japan's weaknesses went beyond money though. Material was also a big issue. Japan had vastly improved its domestic arms industry since the Meiji Restoration. However, it was still far from being totally independent, especially at sea. After Tsushima, Togo had all but run out of ammunition, and the bores of his big guns were worn out and in need of replacement. That was something they would need British help for, since they built many of the battleships in the Japanese Navy. More critically though, Japan was low on coal. Welsh coal was their primary source, and the Imperial Navy had burned through their supplies over the course of the war. And like I mentioned earlier, their manpower was facing a crisis point. Oyama had admitted as much when he stated, "While the enemy still has powerful forces in his home country, we have already exhausted ours." 15 months of all-out war had brought Japan to the edge. Simply put, Japan was at the end of its rope. Facing shortages of men, material, and money made Japanese leadership focus their peace treaty goals on their pre-war goals. The pre-war goals had 3 primary objectives. 1. Secure Korea. 2. Secure the Liaodong Peninsula. And 3. Secure a buffer region for Korea in Manchuria. Those were Japan's red line items. And the good news was that they were in possession of all 3 at the end of the war. A war indemnity and possession of Sakhalin were seen as of secondary importance, not worth the risk of peace negotiations collapsing because of. Now comes the bad news. Japan's press was rigorously controlled by the state, and throughout the war they had touted victory after victory in the highest ways possible. This meant that the people of Japan expected to get everything they wanted at the negotiating table. Most importantly, a war indemnity. They had, after all, won every battle and soundly defeated the Russians, so they couldn't envision a peace treaty in which they did not rightly get a victorious payment. Well, they were in for a rude awakening. The chief negotiator sent to Portsmouth for the Japanese was Foreign Minister Komura. Ito was initially pegged as the best man for the job, but he was unsure that the conference would bring peace, and did not want to be the scapegoat if it failed. More so, he felt Prime Minister Katsura should take responsibility for the war, since his administration started it, and so his administration should also lead the peace talks. Ito had been forced to resign as Prime Minister back in 1901, although he still was an influential figure in Japanese politics. Okay, on to the United States. The US didn't actively fight in this war, and it occurred in Asia, so why did Teddy Roosevelt get involved at all? Teddy had assumed the presidency at age 42, the youngest ever president in US history. Teddy is a very fascinating historic figure, but what you need to know in the context of these negotiations was that he was deeply interested in Asian affairs. Teddy had fully bought into John Hay's open door policy, and believed Japan would be best positioned to preserve open door in Asia. Teddy was pro-Japanese before the war because of Russian moves to secure their holdings in Manchuria. However, what he did not want was Japan to so thoroughly defeat Russia as to collapse their presence in the region. Balance was key. And so he pushed Japan to come to the peace table before the war could get out of hand, and possibly lead to the collapse of the Russian state. In the summer of 1905, Teddy would be solely in charge of US foreign policy. John Hay, his legendary Secretary of State, died on July 1st before Portsmouth began. Ultimately, the main US goal was to help guide a peace treaty to be signed to prevent a drawn-out war of attrition. That peace treaty would leave Japan as the main power in Asia, but not with Russia being totally removed as a player on the continent. When negotiations began on August 8th, Witte and the Russians formulated an effective strategy. They would agree immediately and not put up a fight over things of no critical importance to the empire, like control of Korea, for example. However, the important matters, like war indemnity, is where they would draw a hard line. In that strategy, if negotiations ruptured, it would seem to be Japan's fault for asking for too much. Furthermore, Witte undertook a brilliant PR plan. He would woo the United States. Witte showered compliments on the US president, the people, and the press in order to receive a favorable reception and coverage. Witte wanted to persuade the US and the world that the Japanese were fighting for material gain, and not for the open door policy like the Japanese had said before the war. The first peace proposal was presented by Komura and the Japanese delegation. It held no surprises. The Japanese wanted the following. Number 1, acknowledgement of paramount Japanese interest in Korea. Number 2, Russian evacuation of Manchuria. Number 3, Japanese rehabilitation of Manchuria. Number 4, both Russia and Japan agree not to interfere in China. Number 5, cessation of the entire island of Sakhalin from Russia to Japan. Number 6, transfer of the Liaodong Peninsula lease from Russia to Japan. In particular, control of the ports of Arthur and Dalny. Number 7, transfer of Russian railroads in Manchuria and on the Liaodong Peninsula to Japanese control. Number 8, an indemnity payment by Russia to cover Japanese costs of the war. Number 9, Japan gets to take all the Russian warships that they captured or sought asylum in a neutral port during the war. Number 10, limitation of Russian naval strength in the Far East. And number 11, full fishing rights for Japan along the coasts bays, and rivers of all of the Russian Far East. Witte took this proposal and followed his plan of conceding to all the easy points, and stiffening on the red line items. Witte had always disapproved of Russian intervention into Korea, and so he immediately accepted Japanese demands there. As well, he saw no reason to hold on to Russian troops in Manchuria, especially since he had been in favor of pulling them out 5 years ago. The main 2 points where Witte dug in his heels were the indemnity payment and the cessation of Sakhalin. Witte was adamant that Russia would not accept peace at any price. Japan had wanted the war indemnity not just for economic reasons, but also for prestige. In this era, when you won a war, it was traditional to receive a tribute as the victor. That was called an indemnity. The Japanese had received one after the Sino-Japanese War, and they felt they deserved it in this case as well, especially since it was a war against a Western power. Receiving an indemnity from a Western power would catapult the Japanese Empire as an equal to the Western ones. Teddy had wanted the 2 powers to deal with each item separately, so that the more difficult problem points could be isolated. On August 15th, after some strong progress, the Sakhalin question came up. Witte and Nicholas had been adamant they would never concede Russian territory, even though it had only become full Russian territory in 1875, and was currently in the possession of the Japanese. The Japanese countered by offering to ransom the island back to Russia for the price of $150 million. In that scenario, Japan's war indemnity would be covered by the ransoming of Sakhalin back to Russia. Even this kind of compromise did not sit well with the Russians. Nicholas was not going to pay a dime to the Japanese. He would sooner join the field army in Manchuria than pay Japan. When Witte had met with the French premier before Portsmouth, and the premier had stated that French loans would be available in the event of Russia having to pay a war indemnity payment, Revere had pointed out that France had to pay a war indemnity payment to Germany after the Franco-Prussian War without losing its pride. Witte responded by stating that if the Japanese had reached Moscow, we might reconsider. That right there showcases perfectly Russian leverage to avoid paying a war indemnity. Japan did not have in possession anything that Russia was willing to pay to recover. On August 21st, Teddy decided to personally intervene. He urged the Tsar to accept a partition of Sakhalin. Russia would control the north, and Japan would control the south. And in Teddy's proposal, the Russians would have to pay a substantial sum for the Japanese to give back the northern half. No dice. The Tsar would not have it. Then, on August 23rd, Witte proposed that the Japanese could keep the entire island of Sakhalin, but they had to drop their claims for reparations. When Komura rejected this proposal, Witte warned that he was instructed to cease negotiations and that the war would resume. This ultimatum came as 4 new Russian divisions arrived in Manchuria. The Russian delegation then made an overt show of packing their bags and preparing to depart. It seemed as though the war was certain to resume. Witte was playing a bold strategy, but he was convinced that the Japanese could not afford to restart the war, and so he applied maximum pressure via the American media and his American hosts to convince the Japanese that monetary compensation was not open for compromise by the Russians. Outmaneuvered by Witte, Komura yielded, and in exchange for the southern half of Sakhalin, the Japanese dropped their claims for reparations. The Japanese could have had full control of the island of Sakhalin just a few days prior. The Treaty of Portsmouth would be officially signed on September 5th, 1905, bringing the Russo-Japanese War to an end. The treaty was seen as a massive diplomatic victory for Witte and the Russians. The only victory of the war for the Russians, ironically. Despite having lost every battle on land and sea, the Russians had managed to maintain control of half of the island of Sakhalin without having to pay any money to the victorious Japanese. The key terms of the treaty were: number 1, Japan has full control in Korea. Number 2, transfer of the Russian Liaodong Peninsula lease from Russia to Japan. Number 3, the Russian rail line through Manchuria was divided. Japan took over the southern branch, from Port Arthur to Changchun, while Russia maintained control of the northern line through Harbin. Number 4, both countries agreed to leave Manchuria, except for Japanese control of the Liaodong Peninsula. Number 5, both Russia and Japan agreed to not interfere in China. Number 6, Russia gets the northern half of Sakhalin, and Japan the southern half. And number 7, Japan would get full fishing rights along the Russian coast in the Far East. In the aftermath of the Treaty of Portsmouth, the three powers involved would have varying futures. For the United States, Teddy Roosevelt won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1906 for his successful mediation to the end of the conflict. The United States had gained a lot of prestige on the global scene, an area the country had rarely ventured into in its past. As well, the US was now a lead power in the Pacific region. In all, Teddy's intervention felt like a success. In Japan, the word success would not be attributed to the Treaty of Portsmouth. The Japanese public was outraged that no war indemnity was forthcoming. Much of the blame and anger went to their leaders, but more significantly, it also went towards the United States. Before the war, Japan and the United States had strong relations. The US was like a big brother nation to Japan. After the treaty, Japan had felt like the US had aided Russia in the negotiations in order to prevent Japan from getting the payment that she rightfully deserved. Riots would actually break out in Tokyo on September 5th, the same day the treaty was signed. Much of the anger of the rioters was directed at the United States. Katsura's government would actually fall in January of 1906, in large part due to the Treaty of Portsmouth. In the ultimate symbolism, on the night of September 11th, shortly after the treaty was signed, the Japanese battleship Mikasa, which was Togo's flagship at the Battle of Tsushima, was blasted by an intense internal explosion, which caused her to sink in Sasebo Harbor. It was most likely caused by the carelessness of the crew, but the public saw it as the Mikasa committing seppuku to wipe out the stain of a dishonorable peace. The Treaty of Portsmouth would dramatically alter the course of Asia, leading the United States and Imperial Japan down a collision course, which would have bloody consequences, bringing the United States into the Second World War, as the two powers fought it out over who would reign supreme in the Pacific. In Russia, though, the response was more muted. Sure, Witte was celebrated for having negotiated masterfully, but the Russian Revolution of 1905 was still ongoing at this point, and so the end of an unpopular war in the Far East did nothing to quell that turmoil. Nicholas would ultimately agree to reforms like establishing the Duma, which was an elected legislature, but it would not fully stop the tide of revolution. Another unpopular war with a high cost in casualties and treasure would lead to the end of Tsarist Russia in 1917 during World War I. Before I end this video, I think it would be good to do an analysis on the Treaty of Portsmouth. Did the Japanese have a right to feel angry at the terms? Were they actually unfair to a nation who had won every battle in the war? Or was this the best deal they could have hoped for, adequately representing the situation in the field? In the next and final section of this video, I will answer those pivotal questions. Before I go into whether this was a fair treaty, I want to, surprise, add some context. Mainly context around how treaties to end wars were negotiated in this era. In particular, what was standard practice for victorious powers to receive after their win. The war that set the standard for how a victor would be compensated was the Franco-Prussian War of 1870. During that war, the Germanic allies, led by Prussia, firmly defeated the French. The Germans won every single battle of the war, and when it came time to negotiate a peace to end the fighting, the terms were harsh. Bismarck, who negotiated on the German side, knew they were in a strong position with a ton of leverage on the French. They had won every battle, and were currently occupying a large portion of the country. In fact, they had taken the capital of Paris. The French were in no position to resist Bismarck's demands, because if they did, the German army would just continually occupy France until they did agree. Bismarck's goal with this treaty was to create such harsh terms for France that they would not be a threat to the newly created German state for 50 years. The three major provisions of the Treaty of Frankfurt to end the war were: number 1, the Alsace and Lorraine regions were ceded to Germany. Number 2, France would pay Germany 5 billion francs and be occupied until it was fully paid. In other words, a war indemnity. And number 3, German troops would have a victory march through Paris. Number 2 was the important one in this era. This heavy war indemnity payment was a huge departure from historical norms. Usually the reparation payment for the victorious power simply covered their war expenses. However, Bismarck and the new German state were receiving well beyond just their war expenses. Just like that, a war indemnity became standard practice after a great victory. Japan had first-hand experience with receiving a war indemnity. After the Sino-Japanese War, China was forced to pay Japan a war indemnity of 2 million taels of silver, with an additional 30 million taels paid after the Triple Intervention. So it seems pretty logical, and even deserving, that Japan should have received a war indemnity after the Russo-Japanese War, right? After all, much like the Germans in 1870, they had soundly defeated their enemy in every single battle, and occupied all the strategic territory the war was fought over. Seems only just that Japan should have received a war indemnity. When you look at it that way, it does appear as though Japan was screwed at Portsmouth. However, that view lacks depth and context. Japan may have taken all the key strategic ground the war was fought over, like Korea, the Liaodong Peninsula, and parts of Manchuria, but they did not take anything that Russia truly owned. Korea had never been in the Russian sphere of influence or direct control, while Manchuria in the Liaodong Peninsula had been Chinese territory, only leased to Russia. That is massively important. A war indemnity sounds like a prize given to the victorious nation at the end of the war, but it's not really that. Instead, it is a payment by the defeated power to a victor in order to get something back, usually to get back territory. Like at the end of the Franco-Prussian War, the reason France paid Germany was not because Germany won, but to get German forces to leave French land. Another good example is the end of World War I and the Treaty of Versailles. In that treaty, Germany agreed to pay a massive war indemnity. But the question is, why? During that negotiation, Germany was not occupied. The armistice had been agreed to before the Allied forces had pushed deep into German territory. And so you may wonder, what did Germany pay to get back in that scenario? They paid to get back the flow of food. During the Treaty of Versailles, the Royal Navy maintained its blockade of German ports, in order to put maximum pressure on German negotiators to agree, and to give Allied negotiators leverage at this peace conference. The Royal Navy's blockade of German ports was a big reason why the standard of living had declined in Germany throughout the war, and ultimately forced the collapse of their war effort. In order to get an opposing side to agree to an indemnity payment, you must have one of two types of leverage at the negotiating table. Number one, territory. And not just any territory, though. You need territory that is vital to the other side's existence. Like in the Franco-Prussian War, the Germans had control of a large portion of France and their capital, Paris. Number two, critical damage. Your forces must be in a position that they can do continual and unrelenting damage to the state you are negotiating against. At the end of World War I, the Royal Navy's blockade could continue to do critical damage to German society for as long as they wanted. With that in mind, let's revisit the Treaty of Portsmouth. Japan had virtually zero control of any Russian territory at the end of the war. The only Russian land they did have was Sakhalin, and that wasn't even fully Russian until 1875. So definitely not something Russia would be willing to pay in order to get back. What about critical damage? I mean, they had destroyed the Russian Navy and won every land battle. That seems pretty critical. Well, not really. For one, Russia could replace its land losses without too much trouble. And they didn't need the sea lanes to reach the Far East. The Trans-Siberian Railroad could get them there. Plus, Japan hadn't decisively destroyed the Russian army in Manchuria. That force was continuing to gather strength during Portsmouth. Even if, by some crazy miracle, Japan could have kept pushing into Russian land, there was nothing in the Far East Russia was afraid Japan could take and hold. Russian centers of power were in Europe, like St. Petersburg and Moscow. Japan had no ability to threaten those vital areas. That is why Russia did not feel the need to pay a war indemnity. Simply put, the Japanese had no threat or possession that was worth paying for. The next problem for why Japan couldn't get everything it wanted, despite their battlefield successes, was the leverage problem. In all negotiations, whether it be in business or at the end of a war, the key is leverage. Just because you win on the battlefield doesn't mean you have leverage at the negotiating table. We have already covered the fact that Japan didn't have anything Russia was truly desperate to protect or get back. Beyond that, Japan did not have the ability to continue the war. And Vita knew this. Vita knew Japan just didn't have the manpower, materials, or economy to support a long drawn-out war of attrition. And they needed peace as badly as the Russians did. That gave the Russians strong leverage at the peace table. Russia could negotiate as equals with Japan, rather than as a vanquished foe bowing to a victor's demands. Sure, Russia was in a state of revolution over an unpopular war that could have led to the end of the monarchy if the conflict continued. But Russian leadership was willing to gamble the collapse of their empire on not paying a war indemnity. It was a really risky gamble. The Japanese, on the other hand, were not willing to exhaust themselves to receive monetary compensation or to keep Sakhalin. The Russians would gamble their monarchy again during World War I. And I think it's important to note the surrender terms the Russian nation was forced to sign in order to end that war with Germany. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk forced Russia to cede vast territories, including Ukraine, the Baltic states, Poland, and Finland, to the Central Powers, mainly Germany and Austria-Hungary. As well, they ceded territory to the Ottoman Empire. Russia also recognized Ukraine's independence and had to pay a significant war reparation to Germany. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk was made null by the eventual Allied victory, but it showcases how Russian internal weaknesses and the threat of the German armies sweeping over their main centers of power led the Russian leadership to agree to harsh surrender terms. The Germans had the leverage that Japan was never able to get. You also might be tempted to state that even if Japan took more strategic ground, Russia would not have buckled. After all, Napoleon had taken Moscow, and that didn't matter. However, Napoleon never got to the negotiating stage after taking Moscow. His army was forced to retreat back west, in large part due to the Moscow fire. That fire prevented him from using the city as leverage. Back to the Treaty of Portsmouth analysis. In the end, Japan had already won everything that was actually important to their state. When the war broke out, Japan was looking to gain 3 things. 1. To bring the Korean peninsula under Japanese domain. Number 2. To secure the Korean peninsula strategically. That meant taking over the Liaodong Peninsula. Without control of that peninsula, the Japanese grip on the peninsula would never be secure, since whoever had Port Arthur could easily interdict the path to Incheon Harbor from the sea. Essentially, the western coast of Korea was dictated by who controlled the Liaodong Peninsula. Number 3. Add a buffer to protect Korea. That buffer would be the Manchurian region around Liaoyang and Mukden. By adding that buffer, they could keep other powers away from the land side of Japan's precious Korean peninsula. Japan had all 3 of those firmly in hand at the end of the war. And the Russians put up 0 fight in the Japanese getting those 3 things. Japan had won the Russo-Japanese War, and more importantly, secured the possessions they truly wanted and needed. As well, Russia would no longer be a rival in the Far East, since their ambitions had been thoroughly curbed, and their weak domestic position at this point made the empire unlikely to refocus on the Far East. The disappointment with the Treaty of Portsmouth comes from a lack of context. Context that was not provided by the Japanese press. The press fed the flames of Japanese victory, which in turn led the Japanese public to not see the weaknesses of their position at Portsmouth. The Japanese government also bears blame here, since they controlled the press and were determined never to appear weak. By admitting their nation had been in no position to continue the war after the treaty was signed, it would have meant denying the invincibility of their army and navy. The Japanese government of the early 1900s had designed its strength around the projection of its military power, and so admitting that they were not invincible was out of the question. This invincibility complex would ultimately push Japanese leadership to attempt to take on its new rival in the Pacific, the United States. They even tried the same blueprint as the Russo-Japanese War, starting with a surprise attack to destroy their enemy's naval power in the Pacific, and then supplementing that attack with follow-up land invasions to secure the ground Imperial Japan wanted. However, the United States was not as easily defeated as the Russians were in 1904 to 05. If they were, the US would have sued for peace after Pearl Harbor, and the key possessions the Japanese had gained in 1941 and 42 would have looked a lot like the key positions they had gained in the Russo-Japanese War. Instead, the United States, along with its allies, would roll back all of the Japanese gains, and ultimately force them to unconditionally surrender in 1945. Would the Russians have been able to roll back Japanese gains if the war continued instead of the Treaty of Portsmouth? Maybe, maybe not. The Russian state was a mess at this time. so it could very easily have led to the collapse of their empire, like it did during World War I. But that's a topic for alternate historians to cover, not me. In the end, Japan got everything it actually wanted in this peace treaty, while in return for that, the Russians got to save face. For a negotiation to be completed, both sides need a little something in order to accept. Unless, of course, you defeat your enemy so thoroughly, you get to ask for unconditional surrender, and can dictate whatever terms you want. Well, that's it for this video. Thank you for watching. I tried my very best with these Russian, Japanese, Korean, and Chinese pronunciations. I think I did a decent job, but I'm sure the commenters will let me know. I hope this contextual breakdown of Portsmouth helps you gain a better understanding for peace negotiations, and why winning battles isn't the sole determining factor in who gets what at the end of a war.